They laughed before I even got the door open. That's the part I remember clearest. Not the truck door creaking on its hinge, not the gravel crunching under 22-year-old tires, but the laughter that was already waiting for me before I'd taken a single step onto the property I had bled for. My brother-in-law, Grant Ashford, stood on the porch of the main house in a pressed linen shirt, a glass of something amber in his hand, and he didn't even bother lowering his voice. "Well, would you look at that?" he said to the cluster of cousins around him. Wyatt finally made it. In that, he said that the way you'd say it about roadkill. My truck, a 2004 Chevy Silverado the color of a faded stop sign, rattled to a stop in the circular drive between a Range Rover and a brand-new Denali, and for one long, ugly second, nobody moved. Nobody waved. They just watched me climb out in my work boots and my flannel, the same way you'd watch a stray dog wander into a wedding. I had come home for my father's memorial gathering, to the ranch he had built with 40 years of his own hands, and I was about to find out exactly how far some people will go to convince themselves that the man who actually owns the ground under their feet doesn't belong on it. The Texas hill country in late October wears a kind of gold you don't find anywhere else. Low sun catching the live oaks, the limestone ridges turning the color of old bone. Callaway Ridge Ranch sat on 900 acres of that gold, land my father Thomas Callaway had scraped and mortgaged and nearly lost twice to build into something worth envying. I was 36 years old, and to anyone looking at me that afternoon, I was nothing worth noticing. Sun-cracked hands, a truck with 240,000 miles on it and a check engine light that had been on so long I'd stopped seeing it. A quiet, unremarkable man who had spent the last 6 years doing the kind of work nobody at that party would have wanted to talk about at dinner. What none of them knew, what none of them had bothered to ask in 6 years, was that 11 months earlier, when the bank had called my father's note due and threatened to auction off every acre of Callaway Ridge, I was the one who had walked into that bank and paid it off, in full, in cash. The deed to that entire ranch, main house included, had been sitting in my name since the second week of December. I hadn't told a soul. Not because I was hiding something shameful, but because I had learned a long time ago that some kinds of truth are only worth telling to people who've earned the right to hear them. My family had not earned it. Not yet. Grant set his glass down on the porch rail hard enough that the ice cubes jumped. He'd married my sister 9 years ago and had spent every one of those years auditioning for a role he'd already been given, the successful one. The real estate man from Austin who flipped ranches for people richer than himself and talked about land value the way other men talked about their children. He came down the porch steps with the particular swagger of a man who has never once in his life doubted that a room belongs to him. "You didn't have to come, you know," he said, loud enough for the yard to hear. "Nobody would have blamed you for sitting this one out. Given, you know." He gestured at the truck, at my boots, at all of me, with one lazy hand. The optics. My sister Emily stood near the porch with her arms crossed, not laughing, but not stopping it either, which in its own way was its own kind of answer. Behind them, cousins I hadn't seen in years were pretending to check their phones while they watched. Somewhere past the house, past the cattle guard, a hawk rode a thermal in slow, patient circles, the way hawks do when they've already decided exactly where they're going to land. "I'm here for Dad," I said. It was the only thing I trusted myself to say. "Sure," Grant said, and smiled the kind of smile that had never once in his life cost him anything. "Sure you are," I didn't argue. I've learned that a disciplined man doesn't spend his ammunition on the first shot fired. I walked past him, past the whispers, past the Range Rover and the Denali gleaming like they owned the sunlight, and I did not look back at my truck sitting crooked in that driveway like something somebody's maid had forgotten to move. The house my father built rose up in front of me, limestone and cedar, a wraparound porch he had framed himself the summer I turned 12, and I felt for just a moment something that wasn't anger at all. It was grief, plain and simple, the kind that doesn't care what your brother-in-law thinks of your truck. I had no idea walking up those steps that by sundown Grant Ashford would be standing in that same driveway watching a Bexar County Sheriff's cruiser roll up the gravel, about to learn exactly whose land he'd been standing on his entire marriage. Inside, The house smelled like my mother's cooking, even though she'd been gone 6 years, and the kitchen now belonged to a caterer Grant had, hired without asking anyone in the family whether they wanted their father's memorial catered by a company called Hill Country Elevated Bites. Round tables draped in white linen sat where my father's scarred oak dining table used to be, and I understood, looking at that room, that this gathering wasn't really about mourning Thomas Calloway. It was about something else entirely, something I wouldn't fully understand until the second half of that afternoon. My Aunt Carol hugged me stiffly. The way you hug someone you've already decided is a disappointment, but feel obligated to acknowledge. My cousin Dean asked, without a hint of shame, whether I was still doing that ranch hand thing, and when I said something non-committal, he actually laughed, a short, dismissive bark, and turned back to his phone. Nobody asked where I'd been the last 6 years. Nobody asked why my hands were the way they were, calloused and scarred across the knuckles in a pattern that, if you knew what to look for, you'd have recognized from men who'd spent years handling wire and steel and livestock under conditions most people only see in documentaries. They had already decided who I was. A man in a truck the color of embarrassment. A man who had, in their eyes, simply failed to become his brother-in-law. My cousin Dean's wife, a woman I'd met exactly twice, leaned toward her husband as I walked past and said, not quietly enough, "I heard he's been sleeping in that truck." It wasn't true, but I let it sit there uncorrected, because correcting it would have meant explaining myself to people who had already decided the explanation wasn't worth their time. A group of second cousins near the drink table traded a joke about starting a GoFundMe for Wyatt's transmission and laughed the easy laugh of people who've never once had to wonder whether the ground under their own feet was secure. I'd heard variations of that joke my whole adult life, dressed up differently every year. And I'd trained myself long ago not to let my face show what it cost to hear it at my own father's memorial. I found a folding chair near the back porch and sat with a glass of sweet tea I didn't really want. And I watched Grant work the room like the host of a party he had, in fact, not been invited to host. He'd hired the caterer. He'd arranged the flowers. He'd printed a program with my father's photo on the front and at the bottom, in smaller type than anything else on the page. A line that made my stomach drop the first time I read it. A celebration of Thomas Calloway's life and the future of Calloway Ridge. Not a memory. Not a legacy. A future, like the land was a project with a groundbreaking date. I didn't say anything yet. I wanted to see how far he'd take it. I didn't have to wait long. 40 minutes later, with half the family gathered on the back lawn under a rented white tent, Grant climbed 2 steps onto a small riser someone had set up near the caterer's tables, tapped a fork against his glass, and asked for everyone's attention. "I know today is about Thomas," he began, and I noted, "The way you note a soldier reaching for a weapon he doesn't know you've already seen, that he didn't say Dad or Mr. Calloway or even your father. Just Thomas, like he was talking about a business partner. But Thomas would have wanted us to think about what comes next for this land. I've been talking with a group out of Austin, some serious people, about what Calloway Ridge could become. A boutique resort. Guest cabins along the ridge line. This property, properly developed, is worth $11, maybe $12 million. A ripple of interest moved through the crowd. The particular hush that happens when people hear a number with that many zeros attached to land they've only ever thought of as somebody's backyard. "Now," Grant continued, and here his eyes finally found me, sitting in my folding chair at the edge of the tent in my flannel and my boots. "I know some people in this family might have sentimental attachments. I understand that, but sentiment doesn't pay property taxes, and it doesn't build a future. I think it's time this family had an honest conversation about selling." Nobody looked at me. That was the part that stung more than anything Grant had said all day. Nobody in that tent thought to ask the quiet man in the beat-up truck what he thought about selling his own ranch, because nobody in that tent knew it was his. I set my sweet tea down on the grass beside my chair, and I stood up. "There's not going to be a sale," I said. The words weren't loud. I've never needed volume to be heard, but something in the way I said them cut clean through the tent noise, and every head turned. Grant laughed, that same easy, costless laugh. Wyatt, buddy, I don't think anybody's asking your opinion on real estate strategy. I'm not